Welcome to episode 11 of Free to Speak with Bobby and Paul. I'm Bobby once again, and this is Paul. So last week, Paul, what did we talk about last week? We talked about abortion. I think we ended with a discussion about whose decision is it to have an abortion and what role should a man play in that decision. And you had started talking about how men also themselves can experience trauma from abortion, and we had also talked about how men are oftentimes expected to be there after the woman has the child. So he has responsibility, and that's where child support and things like that comes in. But there's this expectation that men are to stay out of the decision before the baby is born. And that kind of struck both of us as being inconsistent.
Yeah, it's inconsistent in the sense that they engage in coitus together consensually, and then when the girl conceives, she has her say as well to keep it or not, and the guy has no say. And if she says, I'm keeping it, then he's responsible for it. He has to take care of it. And then she says, I'm not keeping it, then he has no say. He has no say.
So why the double standard? Why do you think there's a double standard with this?
The feminist movement has taken a lot of sympathy from the public, and we think more about how women feel. We forget how men feel. We don't really value how men feel. But even men are human beings, and they have emotions and they have attachments.
So they can have trauma over abortion too. So like if
they can have depression, they can have trauma, they can have anxiety, anything can stem out of an abortion, especially if the man didn't consent to the abortion.
So for example, if a man has sex with his girlfriend and the girlfriend decides to abort, the man might feel traumatized by that because that's his child.
Yeah.
But yet he's expected not to have any say, that it's just simply a part of a woman's body. But yet if that child is born, he would be expected
even before being born, the moment she just says, okay, I'm keeping it, he has to take care of it.
But in terms of the decision of whether to abort, the decision is only the woman's choice. And that doesn't really make sense to me. What about the reverse? So we've talked about how the woke people and the feminists will argue that only the woman should be involved in making the choice of whether or not to abort. But are there cases, Paul, when women who do not want to have an abortion can be pressured by men to do so? Like, for example, a father pressuring an underage daughter to have an abortion, or a boyfriend who doesn't want to be a father but pressures his girlfriend to have an abortion. Are there cases where that sort of thing happens, and how often does that sort of thing happen, and what sort of impact does that have on the woman when she's the victim of that sort of thing?
Well, it happens way more often than you would think, given that some men are careless about sexual contact. They just do it for fun, for the thrill. And they try to detach themselves from the emotion with it and the attachment that comes with it. So when the girl that they don't see as desirable, or that they're not actually interested in for real, gets pregnant, ideally they'll feel exasperated by it. They feel like embarrassed, and they just want to push it out. But then, just like the previous discussion, in the end, these men are just being selfish, and ignorant, because just like a man would have his attachments and the woman says she's aborting, even this girl could be attached to her own baby. And maybe they even had hope that they would, raise a family together. You're breaking this girl's heart, and you're making her feel worthless. You're making her feel terrible, that you don't see her as a potentially good mother to your children. So basically, you're damaging her self-esteem even before you consider things like PTSD coming through. You're just damaging her self-esteem, her self-concept, how she looks at herself, and that could bring about severe depression.
So PTSD, I want to dive a little bit more into the issue of PTSD. Do women who have abortions experience PTSD? And we did talk about this in our last video, about how women are oftentimes traumatized by the fact that they've had abortions. But this is actually a controversial position to take, because there are those who deny that women actually have PTSD. They will deny that it's a real issue, that they will say that it's only for people who are believing that an unborn baby is a baby, and so it's more about social pressure, or the social ideals of imposing onto women this idea that that a fetus is actually a baby. And we had a comment, I should say, from somebody that I think we can use to kind of maybe discuss this a little more. This person wrote, you both are right that abortion raises depression and PTSD. And PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. So basically, you experience something very traumatic and that continues to affect you. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about what, the psychologist, a little bit about what PTSD is?
Yeah, so ideally, it is what it is. Post-traumatic stress disorder, when someone is exposed to potentially traumatic events or typical traumatic events. So basically, traumatic events are those where the person in question perceives that their life is threatened or that they could ideally lose their lives. So that is a traumatic incident, for example, an accident, or like let's say a girl bleeds and she feels she's going to bleed to death. Any event where someone could lose their life in it. That's why you find rape is a traumatic event. But then also these traumatic events are relative, or we would say subjective, because what I might find traumatic, Bobby may find normal. Right. Something they can deal with normally. Yes, so recently I was watching Jordan Peterson and he was having a discussion with Destiny, someone called Destiny. And Destiny was so eloquent, is so read and what. So they were just fighting, basically. Everyone had it was an intellectual fight.
Argument, intellectual argument.
And it wasn't leading anywhere. So
a lot of times these kind of things don't go anywhere. But
Jordan Peterson asked him, so what's the point of this argument or this discussion? Because you look like you're set out to win. But then, it's not about winning. It's not about arguing right because what you're arguing is right, that then it should go. About PTSD, and people will say, a girl after abortion, she will not have PTSD, rather she will have guilt from society. That's an argument that could stand, but then it's just arguing to win. The reality is, like I said, a traumatic event is very subjective. So one girl might not be traumatized by abortion at all, but then, like those people argue, the society guilt may catch up with her, and then she, has bouts of depression and any other thing. But then, to another, the idea of losing their child could be traumatic to them. Right. Yeah. Abortion is not just about losing the child, because some abortion procedures are very traumatizing as well. There's a lot of lost blood. Girls feel they're actually going to die. It's life-threatening, for many. At least in the country where I'm at, not everyone can afford some medication. People use forks, they use rudimentary tools to have abortions, and it's very traumatizing. So they can pick up post-traumatic, stress disorder from just that. But in the end, it's still abortion causing post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's not a given that every abortion would lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. Just like it's not a given that everyone who was part of an accident will have post-traumatic stress disorder, and everyone who has experienced war will not have post-traumatic stress. So it's not like everyone. Like I said, these are subjective. How someone perceives a traumatic event is very subjective. So yes, they could be right. Actually, they are right to say that some people, it's just societal guilt that they're dealing with, and that's why they get depressed, and that's right. But then, even post-traumatic disorder is a big risk for some of these ladies. They could struggle with it because, first of all, the abortion procedure is life-threatening. Others, they would still feel like they killed a baby. Even then, you preach to them and tell them all you want, that this fetus is not a baby, you will not change their mind. If someone thinks I killed a baby, you're not going to change that fact by just arguing scientifically right or politically. So it is what it is. Post-traumatic stress disorder comes from a subjective point of view.
With all that in mind, let's then go into this comment that we received from somebody. This person wrote, you are both right that abortion raises depression and PTSD risks. Paul is especially right as a psychologist. Mainstream medicine and psychiatry, including psychiatrists, deny that higher PTSD and depression rates affect women who have abortions by saying things like, it's not the abortion, but it's society guilt, which is what we just talked about. It's society guilt which makes women depressed. And this commenter goes on to say, when in fact, it is that women are depressed and experiencing PTSD because of abortion regret. For a woman who has had an abortion to get depression and PTSD later in life, so let's say she goes through the abortion, it doesn't traumatize her, But then later down the line, it begins to affect her and she begins to experience regret, depression, and PTSD. For a woman who had an abortion to get depressed and PTSD later in life, she would have to change her view on abortion and think that she killed her baby. So maybe a question, there's actually many questions. We've already talked about, many of the things that are in the scroll, but there are many questions that come into my mind here. Is it possible for a woman who has had an abortion, but maybe does not see it as a baby, to still have regret? At the time she did it, it didn't bother her, but now it does create regret in her.
Yeah, so from that point, you still consider the society, because, human beings, we are social beings. You can be, an island, you can be independent because you have a different view. So how people perceive things or what people say, whether we like it or not, it affects how we feel about ourselves. And the fact that people have abortions, some of them even eventually fail to have children later in life.
Because of the complications that came from the abortion, because it causes damage.
Yeah, and how are you going to convince me that when this woman experiences post-traumatic stress disorder, because post-traumatic means it happens way after the exposure to the traumatic event. So what happens, what would you say about the society guilt if the person is actually just struggling to have a baby and now they start feeling, oh my God, I killed my own child, and they are regretting that they killed their own child, and then they start having nightmares about it, and they start remembering everything, having flashbacks. That is PTSD in its actuality. Yeah. So, we don't have to debate about that. It is what it is.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking too, because last week we talked about how the people in the pro-choice camp have all this language. Like they have language, like they call it reproductive care, or they use the word fetus, even though fetus means offspring. But they'll use fetus instead of unborn baby. They have all this terminology that they use so that they don't have to face or deal with the fact that what they're actually killing is a baby.
They're altering the facts.
Right, they're altering the facts. And that's what this denial of PTSD and depression that women experience who have abortions is all about as well. So they want to throw it onto something called societal guilt because they don't want to face the fact that PTSD as a result of abortion is a very real thing. They're minimizing it.
And the funny thing is, not the funny thing, the sad thing.
The sad thing
is that mental illness is, it's complicated because it can be like a domino. In that I might have depression, and then depression might, morph into anxiety, and an anxiety disorder, and then I'll be pushed to cope using drugs and substances, and then I fall into a trap of addiction, and I could move through all the different mental illnesses just because of the onset. And for this particular case, the onset could be the abortion, and the person just moves through all the different.
So you say that the abortion could actually lead to mental illness?
Yeah, well, depression is already a mental illness, and it can move from depression towards PTSD, towards full-time anxiety disorders. And then someone chooses to use drugs to cope with the pain, and then if you find them with an addiction or substance abuse, substance use disorder or alcoholism, it can just keep moving round robin, and people could even end up to the extreme end of suicide or even getting things like schizophrenia. So basically, mental illness is just like I said, a domino. It just keeps the fire just keeps catching. So you find that you could move through a spectrum of mental illnesses just because of the onset.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the topic of mental illness, Paul, because a few weeks ago, when we started doing our discussion about suicide, we had talked about potentially discussing topics of mental illness and also alcoholism, because we were talking about suicide and the whole issue of mental illness. Mental illness ties into issues like suicide. Suicide that we had talked about ties into issues such as mental illness and substance abuse like alcoholism and so forth. And so we had stated that we would come back and we would have discussions about mental illness and about alcoholism, but we actually never came back to it, except we did briefly talk about both these issues related to suicide. But now we have the same topic coming up when we discuss the issue of abortion. So I'm thinking maybe this is a good transition, Paul, for us to talk about some of these wider issues of mental illness, alcoholism, and substance abuse.
Yeah.
I wanted to say one more thing about the abortion topic before we move on to the next discussion here. There was something that I said last week that maybe was a little bit inconsistent with something else that I had said. And that was, I had talked about the fact that I don't believe in punishing women who have had abortions because I feel that they are victims of circumstances. And I kind of feel like that contradicted something else I had said, where I talked about how most abortions are not in these exceptional circumstances of things like rape or incest, and maybe some other things that might fall into exceptional circumstances. But that the vast majority of them are just simply because of people wanting the benefits of sex without the responsibility of the consequences of sex. So the consequences of sex is that you could get pregnant. So in actuality, there's a lot of circumstances where a woman is faced with a decision about whether to have an abortion in which she's not a victim of her circumstances. But even in those conditions, I still would not support punishing a woman or legally punishing a woman who has an abortion, because I think that can actually go against the pro-life cause. Because if we're setting up this situation where we're punishing women who have had abortions, then it's hardening the hearts of the people who are in the pro-choice camp and making it less likely that we're able to actually bring change to move society away from the idea of abortion on demand. So maybe I just wanted to clarify that. Nobody made any comments about how those two statements were inconsistent, but I kind of caught that when I'd watched the video later, and I just wanted to kind of, to clarify that. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, Paul, before we move on. No? All right, then we'll move on to a discussion of mental illness then.
Yeah, so this topic is, ever so pertinent right now, given that it's, May is the Mental Health Month and Mental Health Awareness Month, so people are making efforts to spread awareness about mental illness, mental health, and all these things, which are highly stigmatized and highly misunderstood. Mm-hmm. So we'll want to feed into that space and add our voice.
And maybe we can even tie that in. We talked about issues we talked about before about gender differences, how mental illness can affect men and women differently.
Yeah.
Or at least in terms of how men and women might deal with mental illness.
Yeah. So I'm an advocate of equality in a way. I'm a classical feminist, because feminism, even in psychology, is not typically something about women. It's just about equality. Yeah. So I'm a feminist.
And we talked about this before: equal opportunities.
Yeah.
But not necessarily equal outcomes.
Yeah. So I'm a feminist in the classical sense of it, in a way that it's controversial, but about mental health, me being a feminist in mental health, I'm actually advocating for men's mental health as a feminist in that regard, because men's mental illness or mental wellness is not as well appreciated. It's not as well appreciated.
When men are expected to man up and deal with it, face it, whatever, be strong, kind of thing.
Yeah, so men should be strong apparently, but then, like we said about suicide, they're always committing suicide more than females. And for some reason, it's not causing alarm. We just know it as a fact, but then we don't care. And we're just feeding into the narrative of, men are strong. In a way, we're fighting the patriarchy, but then we are promoting it in essence. Because if you say men should be strong and take care of themselves, that's in the end empowering, showing that men are superior. But then they are not. In the feminist perspective, they are not superior. And that's why they're struggling with mental illnesses, just like females would. As a matter of fact, males are more prone to extremities of mental illness than females. Studies show that amongst substance use disorders, 2/3 of them are male and 1/3 is female.
So 2/3 of those who struggle with substance abuse are males?
Yeah, even alcohol.
Is that a global statistic, or where's
it is a study conducted in South Africa. That's around 2017. It showed, but then it was covering a few countries. So a study showed that for every one woman that falls into the trap of substance use disorder, we have 2 men. And well, much as we have these studies showing that, and it's not just one study, a plethora of them, they would show that men struggle with substance use disorder more than females, even alcoholism. If you choose not to look at alcohol as a substance use, yeah. So males struggle more with it, and we know these facts. But then, for some reason, studies in that direction are less funded. For some reason, efforts, to curb this trend are not funded, and they are given a blind eye. For some reason, men are just left in the dark in their own. And when you find that some of us are anti-woke, it's not because we hate full people or whatever. It's just that we want feminism in its classical sense, in that we want equality. You don't want one person, one gender to be struggling while the other is blossoming. It should be the other. It should be equivalent. Equal.
So there's a reaction to maybe at one time females were struggling, but now males are struggling, and there's kind of a justification for that by saying that, well, historically females have struggled, and so they almost are kind of saying that in order to get equality, you have to bring down the people who are perceived to already be up, and that just doesn't make sense, because when you do that, you bring everybody's down. Then you don't really accomplish anything.
And it's not helping in the mental health field, given that, barring the females who have chosen to go, lesbian or whatever, the ones who intend to get married to men, what happens is that they're getting married to men who are broken. They're getting married to men who are mentally unwell. They're getting married to men who have substance use disorders. Mm-hmm. And then these women, in essence, like I said, mental illness is like a domino. So it has a domino effect, a ripple effect, in that if the man is not well, that means the marriage will not be fine. So even the woman will struggle with mental illness.
Yeah. Because
you can't say that you have a husband that is addicted to alcohol, and he does all those alcohol-induced misbehaviors at home, and then you say you're mentally healthy. You will not be well. The family will not be well. So when you choose to only take care of the women's needs in mental health and neglecting the males, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. Mm-hmm. You're not helping the females, because they will marry these men who are not well prepared to deal with such challenges, and then they'll suffer the consequences. They'll face the music, and this music is ugly.